I'd like to introduce my first guest, Bruce Feldman, and he is a board-certified internist for the last 27 years, and he started his current visiting concierge practice, My Personal Doc, about 7 years ago. He says he's done just about everything in the business, but I'm going to let him tell us what he means by that. He's the physician of My Personal Doc, a concierge medical practice delivering a high-touch, personalized service with a focus on preventive cardiology and integrative wellness. His website is mypersonaldocny.com, and his phone number is 646-801-7541, and he's happy to talk to anyone who calls. So, good afternoon, Dr. Feldman. How are you?
Hi, Sue. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. So I wanted to start by giving us a little bit of background about yourself.
So I started in practice in 1990.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in suburban New York. My father worked in the city his whole life. So, it's funny. Here we are in Stony Brook, and where I went to school in college in Philly, the guys from Long Island would consider us upstate. Right. Now, of course, we lived in Rockland County. We always considered Orange County upstate, but Orange County now people work in the city too. So I don't know where upstate starts anymore.
You're in New York a lot.
I'm a New Yorker. So I've done the entire Northeast corridor. I spent growing up in New York. I went to college in Philly. I did some training in Pittsburgh. I went back to Philly for medical school. I was in Baltimore for residency training, and then went into practice in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where I stayed about 10 years. And during that stay, became pretty clear at that point in time, this was the early 90s, managed care was a huge deal, and basically I was losing a lot of money personally because of that arrangement, and decided that the only way I was not going to lose a lot of money was figure out how the whole system worked. So I actually became a managed care expert and ended up being a liaison to virtually every insurance company in eastern Massachusetts, became part of the Partners system as it was being constructed, participated in the development of that community network, did all kinds of crazy stuff up there, and then came back to New York in 1999 to be assistant chairman of medicine at Beth Israel. Did that for a short period of time, and then because of downsizing at Beth Israel, one of many, and now subsequently they're part of Sinai, so the ultimate downsize, I switched to become a medical director in what it was a Medicaid and Child Health Plus program. We did some extraordinary quality work there, so I have a large history in quality management, population management, cost containment. I then went to a Medicare program, which is now called Touchstone Health, but it was a different construct back then. Again, unique circumstances. Subsequently went to be senior medical director at the Montefiore Care Management Company, where we had a $500 million revenue flow that we were responsible for. And just to give you a taste of what we did there, we ran the largest telehealth program outside the VA hospital in the United States. We developed a diabetic management program that originally had 400 people, and by the time I left, 4 years later, had about 12,000 people under management, and participated in a number of other ventures that saved a lot of money for the system, which we could then plow back into actually taking care of patients. At the end of that tenure, I had come to the conclusion that despite all my best efforts of changing the way healthcare reimbursement was structured and how care was being funneled, I was not being successful in really changing the path of the universe, and decided that what I really should do was go back into practice. And that's
how old were you when that happened? That terrible realization that so many of us come to.
I was 50-ish. So I started back as a primary care guy in an innovative practice model what is now sort of known as direct pay. And it was really at the start of the urgent care phenomenon, and we had an opportunity to blow up urgent care on the west side of Lower Manhattan. St. Vincent's was in the process of closing, but then the company that was sponsoring it decided to pull the plug, and at that point I had just moved to Long Island, so I decided it was time to set up my own thing. And my own thing is my personal doc, which is a concierge practice designed really for professionals, entrepreneurs, folks who are just too busy or too aggravated with the system to go through the usual care model, and have decided that if you want something worth having, you may have to actually pay for it. And since now insurance has such high deductibles, the only time insurance actually kicks in is you've got to get sick first. So to me, it makes no sense. Do you really want to get sick first, or do you actually want to pay money to not get sick? And that's what we help people to do.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of brought you around to that? What is it that the light bulb went off on that?
Well, it's actually my boss at Montefiore was saying to me, you only really get excited when people are screwing up stuff, or, people are being screwed by the system. Shouldn't that tell you something? So I decided that after a while, I let it tell me something. And about 6 months later, I left.
All right. So then you started your own practice. And what is the focus of that?
So it's a general wellness philosophy, which really stems from essentially a cardiovascular health model. Number 1, number 5 causes of death in this country are heart attack and stroke. Of note, of course, the number 4 cause of death is physician medical error. So there's a whole topic on. We could come back for that one.
So lots of reasons to make sure that you don't get yourself caught up in the traditional healthcare system.
Right. So if you, what's interesting is if you do all the right things for cardiovascular health, so many other things melt away. I mean, the integration of diabetes and high blood pressure and cancer, doing the things that keep you from having those sorts of disease processes manifest, really keeps you out of trouble for all of the other things. So, for example, if you do what you're supposed to do for your heart, cancer may be decreased depending on the specific cancer between as little as 50%, but as much as 80 to 90% decreased risk.
So you're able to put together a program, an individualized program for people to help them attain those goals.
Right. It takes an individual focus. I mean, there are a myriad of tests that are available. Frequently, insurance companies don't see the value, and that's a whole population management scheme. So if I can give you an example, the classic one for me is a gene called ApoE. So ApoE comes as ApoE2, 3, and 4. ApoE4, for example, is tied to increased risk of Alzheimer's and cardiovascular disease, increased rate. There are some other combinations with ApoE2, which is much rarer, but the fundamental thing is that when you go to the doctor, they give you the basic concept of moderate aerobic exercise with a moderate fat diet will improve your cholesterol and your overall cardiovascular health. So in 63% of the population, those people with ApoE3, that is exactly the right advice. In the people with ApoE2, that's about 12% of the population, it has almost no effect. And then for the 25% of the population who have ApoE4, you are effectively getting the exact wrong advice. But we don't test for that, so we don't know that.
That's actually very common where, and I think it isn't just in medicine, things get homogenized down to the easiest, the most palatable
soundbite.
Yeah, and formulas so that people don't have to worry about getting too complicated. So that's one of the kinds of things that you're able to do to direct your patients to get onto that path more quickly.
Not to belabor it, but we are all individuals. We have 30,000 genes. They all manifest slightly differently. And there was a very interesting program that I listened to recently that talks about the interplay of these SNPs. So SNP is basically a very short DNA fragment. And when you have these genetic mutations, they have implications. but they don't have nearly the implications that people want to ascribe to them because there's this interplay of a multitude of other genes that come to play and make for the ultimate outcome. Plus, you have your whole lifestyle and all the other things.
So there's lots of things. You know, I when I first met you, and one of the reasons that I was interested in having you on my program was, it turns out one of our mutual friends, he's one of my sailing friends, says, "You got to meet this guy. He saved my life." You know who I'm talking about, Harvey, right?
Sure, yeah.
So.
So I'll tell you the story of Harvey. I mean, Harvey was a 64-year-old man at the time who was...
just so everybody knows, there's no HIPAA violations here because Harvey loves to tell this story,
He loves to tell this story. So he was doing his first triathlon the following weekend and was continuing to have ongoing issues with some chest tightness when he got in the water. He had seen his cardiologist who had put him on a stress test and gave him the A-OK, keep working out. He was nervous. We put him on the test, which is known as the multifunction cardiogram. It's a very easy test. Lay still for 7.5 minutes, sort of like doing an EKG, and except you don't even have to get undressed, really. And at the end of it, it turns out that we have an abnormal finding. And I'm like, well, I got to tell you, with this story that you're telling me, you really need to go back to the cardiologist. You need to get another evaluation. He's going to do a stress test, but don't be satisfied with the stress test. You're going to need an angiogram. So sure enough, he had a stress test. Stress test was normal again. He then got an angiogram, which showed what's called high-grade stenosis, so a narrowing in a significant artery, that he got a stent, and he did his first triathlon a month later and has done a myriad of them since, periodically coming close, if not winning his age group. So,
yes, it's just a great story to hear, mainly because Harvey's somebody that is likes to be hassled out on the water, so I wouldn't want to lose that. I'm a sailor too, so that's how I know him. But also, it's just this great innovation. So I wanted to ask you, what did you call that? A multifunction cardi?
Yeah, so like EKG is the German for electrocardiogram. So ECG is really the abbreviation for an electrocardiogram in this country. ECG, instead of ECG, it's called multifunction cardiogram, is MCG.
Multifunction cardiogram.
Right, so it does more than just measure your electricity. It actually takes the electricity recording, runs it through a series of complex math, which actually, from an engineering perspective, is not very complex. Develops what's known as a systems biology approach. The specific terms are called Lagrangian and Euler mechanics, which really goes to looking at the physics of blood flow and blood cells and the cardiac system. So we get an evaluation of the cardiac system, the functional state of your heart, rather than just your blood flow in large arteries.
That is so interesting. So is this a test that was special for Harvey, or is it special for you? Like, do people get this test normally?
So unfortunately, right now, it continues to be more in the, quote, experimental range.
Okay.
The reality is only in this country, because in Europe and in the Far East, Japan, China, Korea, they're using it quite regularly. So as far as I'm concerned, it is really one of the primary evaluation tools available for cardiac status evaluation. We can actually get people an early window into how their heart health is without putting them on a treadmill. We're using it. We're just launching it officially in the U.S. in emergency rooms, because much like Harvey's experience, if you're having chest pain and you have a certain score, it really tells you that you're at risk for an imminent event.
Otherwise, they just send you home.
These people, many of so there's a huge story that is not told. So right now there are two vast trials that have been done, collected through angiogram catheterization data, coronary catheterizations, of 1 million people.
That's a significant number.
In that 1 million people who have gone to what's called elective angiograms, people who have been told by their doctor they are at risk for some sort of heart problem and need an angiogram. So some of those people have had a stress test. Some of them have not. It's just they're worried. Their doctor's worried. They don't necessarily need a stress test because the stress test is wrong. In women, it's wrong more often than it's right. So that's a great one, but that's a whole nother story. So you've got 1 million people going for angiograms because the doctor thinks that they have issues.
Now, the angiogram, that's an invasive exam,
sure,
right?
You put a catheter in either the groin, or now they do it usually in the arm, and they run it all the way up into the heart.
They're punching holes through your skin, into your arteries.
Into your arteries.
Woo.
And they stick some dye in there, and then they visualize the coronary arteries.
That sounds like a pretty intense procedure.
Well,
they do it a lot, but it's still pretty intense.
It's pretty routine. About 3.5% of the people who go through the procedure have an extended stay in the hospital as a consequence of some sort of problem. And then 0.5%, 0.5% of the people who have that procedure are dead when they're finished.
Okay.
Now, here's the part that gets a little disconcerting. Only 40% of the people who undergo that procedure in the end need it. 60% of them should either not have it at all or could easily have avoided it for something else.
Right. And this
the
is
MCG
where, this is
can
where your
actually
test comes in.
Non-invasively, no radiation, no dye, no stress, no issue. I mean, you can't...
You said you lay down for 7 minutes and you keep your clothes on.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much simpler could it be?
It's about the easiest test you can take. People fall asleep during the test. So,
wow.
We can eliminate virtually all of those people who do not need that angiogram. And just by doing that, you save lives. But all of the money, I mean, each of those angiograms run between $5,000 and $20,000. And this test can be done between, let's say, $500 and $1,000.
Wow. So I'm almost surprised. So it's just shocking to me because if nothing else, the insurance companies or the insurance world is always worried about money. You would think that from a cost basis alone, they would want to jump all over this. So what's the process for that?
So it turns out that in the U.S., it's about 18 years from inception of a technology to incorporation into what I'd call the mainstream, even for the best stuff. So we're right around that number now. The technology was a few years back approved by a Medicare intermediary for evaluation. They were so convinced that it was the right thing to do that they actually put in their local coverage determination that if you did an MCG, you couldn't do a stress test or other cardiovascular imaging for 6 months. Well, the cardiology community, the guys with all their stress tests in their office and all their echoes and everything else, were up in arms. They put in a huge complaint, and the policy was withdrawn. Now, we happen to know, and through communications with the folks at CMS and Medicare, and once Medicare covers it, it will be an easy sort of sell across the board.
Right, that opens the floodgates.
Right. So,
because then the rest of the payers follow.
So we have a Category 3 code, which is defines it as sort of an experimental investigational process that's worth evaluating. But they changed the rules on that, so now the insurance company, even though it's worth evaluating, doesn't have to pay anything for it. So at this point, in our communications with Medicare, if we have a result from a U.S.-based university trial, they will approve us, and that is in the works and should be done relatively soon.
Interesting. So again, today my guest is Dr. Bruce Feldman, and he is a concierge medical practice practitioner, and you can reach him at mypersonaldocny.com, and his phone number is 646-801-7541. So what is the next steps for this, or what if people want to know more about it, or like where is it going? What do you see happening?
Well, so we're developing a whole bunch of different avenues with emergency rooms as a primary target. We're in a conversation with a large facility out west with anesthesia as a preoperative screening tool. There's a huge opportunity in the research arena because we can actually tell functional shifts in real time. So if I can just tell you a really quick story.
Sure.
We were evaluating alternate lead placements in an evaluation of the technology as we move forward. So I had one individual come in and we tested him in the morning. He had a moderate degree of disease. His score is around 4.5. So that's, if somebody's having chest pain, that would qualify him as having a problem right there. We did his test. He has narcolepsy and sleep apnea. It's an interesting combination. So he had forgotten to take his Ritalin in the morning. So he asked if he could take it. I said, sure. 45 minutes, we had occasion to test him again, and his scores went from 4.5 to 6.5, purely on the basis of this new drug, which is not a surprise since it measures blood flow and cardiovascular function. I mean, amphetamine, Ritalin, is going to be boosting the sympathetic drive. It's going to tax the heart, clearly. We had occasion to test him again about an hour and a half later. Well, he's been there sort of hanging around all day, and he's kind of bored. So the next time we test him, he falls asleep. But he's got sleep apnea and is not wearing his mask. So his score goes to 8. And this is all basically in real time, and you can see these changes.
So you could attempt to take the opposite, right?
Correct.
Take a modality where you're trying to determine if something is effective as a corrective measure.
Right. So in fact, thank you for the segue. A few weeks later, I had stopped his Ritalin, put him on some other supplements and some other things to sort of modulate some of his symptomatology, and retested him, and his baseline score was 2.5, which takes him really out of a danger zone completely. So it was quite a turnaround. And I actually was talking to him on the ride up here today. He's one of the people I work with, and we've changed some things, and he is functionally dramatically better. And we know what his MCG scores are, and it's a real time assessment, and it's really quite remarkable. Where I see it as an opportunity, for example, in not really basic science research exactly, but in evaluations of cardiovascular symptoms or cardiovascular evaluation. So, for example, in early phase trials of cardiac drugs, you can actually follow it across the spectrum along the lines of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But in non-cardiac drugs, just to develop a safety profile, you can actually see if your drug has a cardiac effect. And what people fail to recognize, if you have a systemic response, newsflash, your heart is part of that. And frequently when you have a systemic disease, we will see that manifested in your heart.
So fascinating. So now I understand that you're working on this whole thing with getting this test more approved. If somebody was interested in being able to do this right now, is it something that's available to the regular Joe?
Well, I mean, I provide testing opportunities. Sure. Okay. Yeah. And we go to people. It's, wherever they are, either in their office. I mean, that's the practice. I go to their office. I go to their home. And
you have like a little black bag?
I do have a little black bag, but I don't really use the little black bag anymore because it really doesn't accommodate the things that I need to carry. But yes, I do have a little black bag.
So interesting. Again, my guest today has been Dr. Bruce Feldman, and he is a concierge medical practitioner, and you can reach him at mypersonaldocny.com, and his phone number is 646-801-7541.